Les Miserables, Children's Edition, by Victor Hugo, abridged and edited by Matt Larsen, narrated by Benjamin Fife. Part 1. Fantine. Chapter 1. The Bishop. In 1815, Charles Bienvenu Muriel was the Bishop of D. The bishop's home was like a palace, spacious and beautiful. It was built of stone and had an air of greatness about it. There was the bishop's room, the court of honor, the side chambers, all very large with arched walkways between them. There was a garden planted with magnificent trees, and the dining hall was a long, superb gallery, which opened into the garden. Next door was the hospital, a low, narrow, one-story building with a small garden. One day when the bishop had finished visiting the sick in the hospital, he invited the director of the hospital to come with him into his palace. "Director, how many patients do you have?" inquired the bishop. 26 beds, said the director. "They are very crowded, and the ventilation is poor, but at least we have clean sheets. Alas, when a sickness strikes the whole town, we sometimes have more than 100 patients, and we have no room for them. But what can we do, Bishop? This is all we have." They continued talking until they entered the bishop's dining hall, and suddenly the bishop stopped and was silent. He turned towards the director and said, "How many beds do you think this hall alone would contain?" "Your dining hall?" exclaimed the director, confused. The bishop ran his eyes over the hall, measuring it in his head and making calculations. "It will hold 20 beds," he thought to himself. "Director," said the bishop, "there is obviously a mistake here. There are 26 of you in a tiny hospital, and only 3 of us in this whole palace. We have room for 60 at least with all our rooms. We must fix this mistake. You may have my house, and I will have yours. Here is the key. This palace is now your hospital." The next day, all 26 patients were moved into the bishop's palace, and the bishop and his 2 sisters moved into the hospital. When the people of the town heard of the bishop's generosity, they began donating large sums of money to the church. People knocked on the bishop's door all day and all night, some to give and some to receive. He never kept any money for himself. He never bought himself nice things, and he was so welcoming of the poor that the townspeople called him by his middle name, Bienvenu, which means welcome. The bishop's new home only had 6 rooms: the dining room, the prayer room, his bedroom with a guest room attached, and 1 room for each of his sisters. Nothing could be plainer than the bishop's new home: a window, a bookcase, a fireplace that seldom held a fire, and a cross hanging above the mantel. There was a large table with an inkstand where the bishop wrote his sermons, and a dining table with 2 vases of flowers resting upon it. The bishop had only kept 1 bit of luxury, his silver. There were 6 silver dishes with a silver soup ladle, and 2 massive silver candlesticks. Not a door in the house had a lock. At night the door was closed only with a latch. At any hour, anyone walking by could open the door with a simple push. At first this had made his sisters very nervous. The bishop had said to them, "Have bolts on your bedroom doors if you like." Eventually they shared his confidence, and all 3 lived with no locks on their doors. When one sister would worry, he would point at 2 lines written by him on the margin of a Bible. The door of a physician should never be closed. The door of a priest should always be open. A visitor once asked him if he did not fear that something bad would happen, since his house had no locks. Bishop Bienvenu simply replied, "Unless God protects a house, they who guard it watch in vain." Chapter 2. Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean was born to a poor peasant family in Faverolles. He lost his parents when he was very young. His mother died of a fever. His father, a pruner before him, was killed when he fell from the top of a tree. Jean Valjean had but one relative left, his sister, who was a widow with 7 children. Valjean was forced at a young age to become the provider for his sister's family. He worked all day, leaving no time to find a wife or make a family of his own. He earned 18 cents per day as a pruner in the summers, and he worked during the winter doing whatever he could find. That second winter caring for his sister's family was bitter cold. Valjean couldn't find work, and the family had no bread for 7 starving children. One Sunday night, the local baker was just going to bed when he heard a violent crash below in his bakery. He ran downstairs in time to see an arm reaching through the broken window and grabbing a loaf of bread. The baker ran as fast as he could down the stairs and out the door to catch the thief. When he ran him down, he found that the thief was Jean Valjean. Valjean was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in the prison at Toulon. He arrived at the prison on a cart, with a chain around his neck, dressed in red, and he was told he no longer had a name. Prisoners didn't deserve names. He was now to be called by a number, 24601. 4 years he spent working in prison, building enormous strength till he was the strongest of all the prisoners. He was so strong he could have lifted a cart all by himself, and he was nicknamed Jean the Jack. His fellow prisoners convinced him that instead of waiting an entire 5th year to be released, he should use his strength to escape early. He climbed the prison wall by wedging himself in the corner and using his immense strength to get up and over the top of the wall. 2 days later, he was caught and sentenced to an additional 3 years in prison. Jean didn't learn. He tried to escape again in his 6th year, then again in his 10th, and he even made a 4th attempt in his 13th year. Each time the court added more years to his sentence, until finally he served a total of 19 years. He had entered the prison a young man who had tried to help starving children. He left prison an old, angry, and vengeful convict. In 19 years he had earned $109.15 through prison labor. He was given this money, along with a yellow passport, and sent out the door. The year was 1815. He walked all day, in the dust and the heat. About an hour before sunset, he entered the little town of Digne. It would have been hard to find a traveler with a more wretched appearance. A slouched leather cap half hid his sun-bronzed face, which was dripping with sweat. His shaggy chest was visible through his torn red shirt. He walked with weary step into the mayor's office, and then came out headed for the inn. He could smell the goose roasting on the spit, could see the saucepans full of boiling stew. He practically collapsed into a seat as the innkeeper asked, "What will you have?" "Something to eat and a place to sleep." "Nothing could be easier," said the innkeeper, who then looked at the traveler more closely and added, "For pay." Valjean drew from his pocket a large leather purse and answered, "I have money." "Then," said the innkeeper, "I am at your service." Just then a policeman arrived from City Hall and whispered something in the innkeeper's ear. "Is dinner ready?" Valjean asked. "Sir, I cannot feed you dinner. I have no food to spare." "What do you mean? I'm happy to pay for it." "It's not a question of money. I also cannot lodge you here. There is no room in my inn." "Well, put me in the stable, then." "I cannot. The horses take all the room." "Well," said Valjean, "then I'll sleep in the corner on a pile of straw, but we'll see to that after dinner." "I cannot feed you. All the food is reserved for those men over there." Valjean nearly choked as he said, "There are only 12 of them. You have enough food for 20. I am dying with hunger. I have walked since sunrise. I will pay, and I want something to eat." "Get out," said the innkeeper. Then he leaned in close and whispered, "I know who you are. Your name is Jean Valjean. I know what you've done. Now, go away, convict." Valjean bowed his head, picked up his knapsack, and went out. He went to the inn 3 streets over. It took less than 5 minutes for the innkeeper to grab Valjean by the shoulder and say, "Clear out of here!" He was turned away at every inn in town. He began knocking on the doors of random houses, but everyone turned him away. He even crawled into a dog-house, but the dog bit him and chased him off. Exhausted, with no hope of a bed or even a pile of straw, Valjean finally lay down on a stone bench and tried to sleep. "What are you doing there, my friend?" said a woman passing by. He replied harshly and with anger in his voice, "I'm going to sleep." "On the bench?" she asked. "For 19 years I had a wooden mattress. Tonight I have a stone one." "Why don't you go to the inn?" "They turned me away. I have knocked at every door. Everybody has driven me away," he said gruffly. The woman touched the man's arm and pointed to a little low house beside a large hospital. "Have you knocked at that door there?" "No." "Knock there." Chapter 3. The Worth of Silver. The Bishop of D sat writing his sermon while his sisters talked about the gossip in town. A suspicious vagabond, a convict, was lurking somewhere in the town. He might attack anyone at any time. The police had told everyone to lock, bolt, and bar their doors for safety from this vagrant. One of the sisters turned to Bishop Bienvenu and said, "Brother, this house is not safe at all. Let me go get the locksmith to put bolts on our door. It will take but a minute. Right now we are in great danger, not to mention the fact that you have a terrible habit of always saying, 'Come in,' even at midnight. You never bother to see who it is or what they want. You just say." At this moment there was a violent knock on the door. "Come in," said the bishop. The door opened quickly, as if pushed by someone with great strength. A man stepped through the doorway with a knapsack on his back, a stick in his hand, and a fierce look in his eyes. Without waiting for the bishop to speak, the man said in a loud voice, "See here, my name is Jean Valjean. I am a convict. I have been 19 years in prison. I have walked all day, and when I reached this place I went to an inn, and they sent me away on account of my yellow passport. I went to another inn. They said, 'Get out.' Nobody would have me. Finally, a good woman showed me your house and said, 'Knock there.' I have knocked. What is this place? Are you an inn? I am starving with hunger. Can I stay? I will pay." "Sister," said the bishop, "put on another plate." Valjean stepped into the light of the room. "Stop!" he exclaimed. "Did you understand me? I am a galley slave, a convict." He drew from his pocket a large sheet of yellow paper. "Here is my passport, yellow as you see. It says this man is very dangerous." The bishop looked the man straight in the eye and said warmly, "Sir, sit down and warm yourself. Dinner is ready, and your bed will be prepared while you eat." "You won't send me away? But I'm a convict." Valjean stuttered in surprise. "You even called me sir. I shall have a supper? A bed like other people? With mattress and sheets? A real bed? It has been 19 years since I have slept on a bed. You are good people." "Sister," said the bishop, "put his plate as near the fire as you can." Then, turning towards his guest, he added, "You must be cold from the wind, good sir." Every time the bishop said the word "sir," Valjean's face lit up. "Sir Bishop," said the man, "you are a good man. You take me into your house, you make me dinner, and you don't care who I am or where I came from." The bishop touched his hand gently and said, "You need not tell me who you are. This is not my house. It is the house of Christ. It does not ask any comer whether he has a name, but whether he has any pain. You are suffering. You are hungry and thirsty. You don't need to tell me your name. Besides, before you told me, I knew it." Valjean looked at the bishop, confused. "Really? You knew my name?" "Yes," answered the bishop. "Your name is my brother." Valjean stared at him in shocked silence. Dinner was ready. The bishop said the blessing, and then served the soup himself with the silver ladle. Valjean ate ravenously from a silver bowl like a starving beast. The bishop moved one of the silver candlesticks closer to Valjean to help him see, and then filled his bowl again with another ladle full of soup. As dinner ended, Bishop Bienvenu took one of the lighted silver candlesticks from the table, handed the other to his guest, and led Valjean into the spare room with its clean white bed. "Come," said the bishop, "a good night's rest to you. Tomorrow morning, before you go, you shall have a cup of warm milk from our cows." The bishop offered a short prayer, and walked back into his own bedroom. Valjean was so completely exhausted that he did not even crawl between the clean white sheets. He blew out the candle with a snort of his nose, after the manner of convicts, fell on the bed fully dressed, and instantly fell sound asleep. As the cathedral clock struck 2, Jean Valjean awoke. What awoke him was too good a bed. For nearly 20 years he had not slept in a bed, and the soft comfort of a real mattress was too foreign for his body to accept. He opened his eyes and looked around in the darkness. He listened. Not a sound. He got up and started walking toward the door, carefully avoiding the furniture. He could hear the calm, quiet breathing of the sleeping bishop. Valjean went quickly to the cupboard in the dining room. He opened it, took the silver dishes and ladle, crossed the room with hasty stride, and put the silver in his knapsack. Then he ran out the back door, crossed the garden, leaped over the wall like a tiger, and fled. The next day at sunrise, Bishop Bienvenu was walking in the garden when he heard his sister screaming, "Charles! Charles! The silver is gone! Good heavens, it is stolen! That man who came last night took it." The bishop was silent for a moment. Then, raising his serious eyes, he said mildly to his sister, "Did the silver really belong to us? It belonged to the poor. Who was this man? A poor man, apparently. But what are we going to eat with now?" "I guess we'll use wooden plates," he said as he walked back into the house. Just then there was a knock at the door. "Come in," said the bishop as always. The door opened. 3 men were holding a 4th by the collar. The 3 men were policemen. The 4th was Jean Valjean. The police chief advanced towards the bishop, giving a military salute. "Sir?" he said. "Ah, there you are," said the bishop, interrupting the policeman and looking towards Jean Valjean. "I am glad to see you, but I gave you the candlesticks also, which are silver like the rest, and are worth at least $200. Why did you not take them along with the rest?" Jean Valjean opened his eyes and looked at the bishop, dumbfounded. "Sir," said the police chief, "then what this man said was true. He was running away with this silver, so we arrested him." "And he told you," interrupted the bishop again with a smile, "that it had been given him by a good old priest with whom he had passed the night?" Yes, he did say that," said the police chief, confused. "So we can let him go?" "Certainly," replied the bishop. "Thank you for your services, officers. You may go." As the officers walked out the door, the bishop went to the fireplace, took the 2 silver candlesticks, and brought them to Jean Valjean. The bishop said in a low voice, "Never forget what has happened here. You must promise me to use this silver to become an honest man. Jean Valjean, my brother, you belong no longer to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I am buying for you. I withdraw it from dark thoughts and from the spirit of evil, and I give it to God." Chapter 4. Little Gervais. Jean Valjean ran from the city as if he were trying to escape. What had just happened to him? What did it mean? While Valjean was lost in his thoughts, a little boy came skipping down the path toward him. The boy was singing and tossing some coins in the air. As the boy passed Jean Valjean, he tossed the coins once again, and one of them fell from his hands and rolled near Valjean's foot. Jean Valjean moved his foot on top of it. The boy had followed the coin with his eye and looked up at Valjean.
"Sir, my coin, if you please."
"What is your name?" said Jean Valjean.
"Little Gervais, sir."
"Get out of here," growled Jean Valjean.
"Sir,"
continued the boy,
"give me my coin."
Jean Valjean dropped his head and did not answer. The child begged again.
"My coin, sir! Give me my coin!"
He bent down and pushed at Valjean's heavy shoe.
"I want my coin! My 50-cent piece!"
He began to cry.
"Move your foot, please, please!"
Jean Valjean looked at him with a wild, ferocious look of anger and raised his fist. "You'd better clear out, little boy." The boy looked at him in terror, then began to tremble from head to toe, and ran away as fast as he could. Jean Valjean stood there staring at the ground. He didn't know who he was. Was he the convict he had become over 2 decades in prison, or was he the bishop's brother? Had his soul really been bought for God? Who was he? What version of himself would he choose? Valjean moved his foot, bent down, and picked up the coin. He looked around, straining his eyes to see as far as possible in all directions. He saw nothing. Night was falling. The countryside was cold and bare. He began to run in the direction the child had gone, calling out, "Little Gervais! Little Gervais!" He listened. There was no answer. He began to run faster and called out in a desolate and terrified voice, "Little Gervais! Little Gervais!" He yelled and searched till his voice gave out. In despair, his knees suddenly bent under him as he fell exhausted to the ground. His hands clenched his hair as he buried his face in his knees. He whispered to himself, "What a wretch I am!" His heart swelled, and he burst into tears. It was the first time he had cried in 2 decades. The gentle words of the bishop resonated in his head. "You belong no longer to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I am buying for you. I withdraw it from the dark thoughts and from the spirit of evil, and I give it to God." Valjean knew he was no longer the same man. He was changed. He saw 2 men in his mind, the bishop and the prisoner 24601. The image of the bishop grew bigger and brighter in his mind, while 24601, the hideous galley slave, shrank and faded away. In Valjean's mind, the bishop alone remained. He walked all night back the way he had come. When he finally arrived at the door with no locks, he did not knock. He simply knelt down on the ground, and for the first time in his life, Jean Valjean prayed. Chapter 5. Fantine. In the year 1817, a young man named Felix left Paris to go have a season of fun. He was a rich young man whose parents gave him $4,000 a year. He was 30 years old, and was full of jests, joy, and laughter. His rich, easy-going manner made him seem dashingly handsome to all the young ladies he met, but only one girl managed to catch his eye, a young country girl named Fantine. All her friends called her the Blonde, on account of her beautiful hair. She fell instantly in love with Felix, and knew that this was her first and only love. She was certain their love would be eternal. She didn't know that Felix saw it simply as a fun little fling. For nearly 2 years they adored each other. They basked in the sunshine, picking the flowers, running in the fields, and climbing the trees. They spent hours singing, running, dancing, chasing butterflies, and stealing kisses from each other. Then one day, after dinner, Felix told Fantine that he wanted to go and get her a surprise. He kissed her on the forehead and walked out of the cafe. She sat alone, anxiously waiting with her elbows on the table, trying to imagine what he might bring her. A dress? A horse? Oh, maybe even a wedding ring. After nearly an hour, the boy who had been their waiter at dinner came to her table and handed her a letter.
"What is that?" asked Fantine. "It is a paper that the gentleman left for you," he replied.
Fantine snatched the paper from his hands and read, "This is the surprise. Oh, Fantine, my parents miss me and have begged me to return home. To be a good and virtuous son, I must obey. At the moment when you read this, I have already mounted my horse and am on my way back home to my parents. I am gone. Felix Tholomyès. P.S. The dinner is paid for." Fantine ran home and wept bitterly. She cried so loudly that she could hardly hear the screams of the baby. She had given herself to this Felix as a wife gives herself to a husband. The poor girl now had a child. For nearly a year, Fantine tried to make things work. She had been abandoned with no job, no skills, no training, no money, and a child but no husband. She was rejected by her friends and ridiculed by those around her. She desperately needed work, but had no one to care for her child during working hours, so she begged instead. She soon found herself wandering from city to city with nothing but her child and a bag of clothes. As she entered the town of Montfermeil one day, she saw 2 young girls playing in the street while their mother watched from a doorway. Fantine looked up and saw an old inn named the Sergeant of Waterloo. Fantine looked back out at the 2 little girls. The children were well-dressed, smiling with their sparkling eyes and their blooming, laughing faces. The mother, a woman whose appearance was rather forbidding, appeared quite touching at this moment, as she stood in the doorway of the inn. While watching her young ones, she sang a little lullaby. She didn't hear Fantine approaching, until she heard a voice say quite near her,
"You have 2 pretty children there."
The pretty children's mother turned and saw a woman carrying a young child and a large carpet bag. The child was one of the divinest beings that can be imagined, a little girl of 2 or 3 years. She wore a beautiful dress of fine linen and smiled with charmingly rosy cheeks. The mother looked at Fantine and saw that her thick blonde hair was fastened up beneath an ugly bonnet. Her eyes were red from constant tears. She looked pale, weary, and somewhat sick. The woman at the inn offered her a seat.
"My name is Mrs. Thénardier,"
said the mother of the 2 girls.
"My husband and I own this inn."
As they spoke, Fantine told her story, a bit modified. She said she was a working woman, and her husband was dead. Not being able to find work in her hometown, she was going in search of it elsewhere. At this moment, her child awoke, began to laugh, and squirmed out of her mother's arms. Mrs. Thénardier called to her 2 daughters.
"Play together, all 3 of you."
The 2 women continued to chat.
"What do you call your brat?"
asked Mrs. Thénardier.
"Cosette."
How old is she?
She is going on 3 years.
That's the age of my oldest, Eponine. Her sister there is a Zelma.
The 3 young girls were giggling and smiling as if they had known each other for ages.
Children,
exclaimed Mrs. Thénardier.
How soon they know one another. See them? One would swear they were 3 sisters.
These words put an idea into Fantine's head, and she blurted it out instantly.
Will you keep my child for me?
Mrs. Thénardier looked at her in shock.
I cannot take my child with me, Fantine continued. Work forbids it. It is God who has led me to your inn. I see your little ones, so pretty and clean and happy. You are a good mother. They will be like 3 sisters, and then it will not be long before I come back. I'll pay for all her expenses. Will you keep my child for me?
Oh, I must think it over, said Mrs. Thénardier.
I can pay $6 a month, pled Fantine.
Suddenly, a man's voice was heard from within the inn.
Not less than $7 and 6 months paid in advance. That is my husband, said Mrs. Thénardier.
I will give it,
said Fantine.
And $15 extra for the first expenses, added the husband. That's $57, said Mrs. Thénardier.
I will give it, said Fantine. I will go to work, earn some more money, and as soon as I have enough to care for her, I will come for my little love.
Deal,
said the husband. The bargain was made. Fantine stayed that night at their inn and gave her money to the Thénardiers. The next morning left her child behind as she left to seek work. When Fantine had gone, Mr. Thénardier said to his wife,
That money came just in time. I was $50 short. I would have had the sheriff after me by Monday. You turned out to be a good mousetrap with our little ones.